The topic I wanted to end with at the end of this really amazing day is a question I often get asked a lot. You know, Dave has just given this incredible presentation on why Jesus, given all the options. And sometimes, and maybe you've had the same, you meet people who say to you, well, you know, Jesus is all very well. Jesus looks attractive. I'm very drawn to Jesus. But hang on a minute. What about his followers? What about the church and some of what's gone on in history and not so recent history? So that's the question I want to address over kind of my kind of final 25 minutes or so. I'm going to start, since it's a historical topic, in history. And so the location I want to begin in, the place I want to take us to begin, is Jerusalem. The date is the 15th of July, 1099. And the previous night, the Crusader armies that had been besieging the city for the last few days finally broke through. And 10,000 heavily armed Crusaders fought their way up to the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in Islam. And there in the Temple Mount area, many civilians had sought refuge from the invading armies. And what follows is one of the bloodiest episodes in the history of the church, because the Crusaders killed thousands, including elderly people, including women, including children. And one contemporary chronicler, Raymond of Aguilar, wrote this description about what happened when the Crusaders broke into the Temple Mount area. He tells us piles of heads and hands and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. Men rode in blood up to their knees. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers. This day will be famous throughout all future generations, for it turned our labors and sorrows into joy and exaltation. This day, I say, marks the justification of all Christianity. Now it gets worse because after the slaughter, if it's possible it gets worse, because after the slaughter, the Crusaders, or pilgrims, as they like to designate themselves, did of course what you do. They decided they'd hold a church service. And so they marched to the nearby Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they held a thanksgiving service for their victory. You know, the irony and the hypocrisy are almost unbelievable, because of course the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site of Jesus' tomb, the place his body had been laid after his death 1,000 years before on a Roman cross. And of course this is the Jesus who was famous for his radical non-violence. The Jesus who, even as he hung dying on that cross, prayed, "Father, forgive them," and the Jesus who had preached, "Love your enemies." Now, if we had time, we might sort of dig into the fact that, you know, sure, there were complex political reasons for the Crusades, and many of the reasons behind the Crusades, rather, were political and not religious. And in fact, that's largely the case throughout history. A few years ago, a massive 2-volume book was published, a very cheerful bedtime reading. It's called The Encyclopedia of Wars. It documents 1,763 wars between 8,000 BC and about 2008. And of those 1,763 wars, just 123 are characterized by the historians, the academics who put this book together, as religious. That is just 7% in 10,000 years of history. So if Christians are inherently violent, we have a bit of catching up to do. But all that aside, when you look back at the Crusades, you cannot escape facing the question of how was it that Christians allowed themselves, how is it the church allowed herself to be co-opted by the state with such tragic consequences? Now, if only it was back in history, if only it was 1,000 years ago, but it's not. There are more recent examples. The problem of religion and violence has not gone away. In fact, throughout history, there have been other times when the church and those bearing the name Christian have not lived up to those high ideals and ethics of Jesus. For example, in the 20th century, in Nazi Germany, many Christians failed to stand up to the Third Reich. They didn't stand up to the evil of Nazism. In fact, sadly, many church leaders actually cozied up to power, and they capitulated rather than risk their lives to take a stand. And even further up to date, there are more recent examples. Consider the Troubles there in Northern Ireland. And beginning in 1968, the so-called Troubles saw 30 years of sectarian violence. On one side, you had the Protestant loyalists who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of Britain. On the other side, you had the Catholic nationalists who wanted the province to join the Republic of Ireland, from which it had won its independence in 1921. And for 3 decades, Northern Ireland was ripped apart, torn apart by sectarian violence, by beatings, shootings, bombings, and of course much of that spilling over here onto the mainland UK. And perhaps if you were going to sort of single out one example from that whole period of the Troubles as just perhaps the worst example of the kind of sectarian violence that we saw, to me, the obvious candidate would have been in November 1987, when on the 8th of November, a nationalist bomb exploded in the small town of Enniskillen during the Remembrance Day parade, killing many, many civilians and injuring even children and families. Well, the Troubles, you may recall, came to an end on Good Friday in 1998, when the major parties on both sides of the violence reached a peace agreement. But still today, I don't know how many of you have been in recent times to Belfast. If you go to Belfast today, I was there a couple of years ago speaking, you can still see the massive so-called peace walls that are built in that city, separating key communities, separating Protestant and Catholic, nationalist and Republican communities. I remember when I was there a couple of years ago, walking past things like this and almost wanting to weep, really, and saying, how can, in the 21st century, not merely communities be so divided, but communities containing people who claim to be Christians be so divided and so hate each other? And quite frankly, I look at all of this nonsense, whether it's Northern Ireland, or the Church and Nazism, or the Crusades, or many other examples if we had the time. And I want to begin by, I guess, saying I'm just utterly ashamed of it. Horrified of it, utterly ashamed of it, ashamed and heartbroken that the message of Jesus has ever, even remotely been associated with hatred, with violence, with the barrel of a gun, or the explosive force of a bomb. And just like Ben said in his talk, that perhaps in engaging with our LGBT friends, we need to begin with apology. I think when people raise the issue of the church in history, the best place to begin is with apology, and realizing that at times the church has gone horribly, horribly wrong. And of course, the reason I think we're horrified by it, of course, it is such a utter warping of the message of Jesus. And quite frankly, no other figure I can think of, no other religious figure in history, was so scathing or critical about the use of violence in the name of religion. As we saw, Jesus said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the left cheek, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing is, when you look back through history, for the first 300 years, Christians did a remarkably good job of living up to those high standards of Jesus Christ. All the more remarkable because for those first 300 years of the church's existence, the Roman imperial powers were persecuting the church and arresting Christians and torturing them, executing them, but still Christians held the line in terms of that non-violent message of Jesus. One of the worst tyrants there in the first century, the Emperor Nero, was notorious for the way that he would treat Christians. One of Nero's favourite tricks. NATO? Where did that come from? One of Nero's 4 letters beginning with N, ending with O. It's tiring up here. Need more coffee. One of Nero's favourite routines was he would tie Christian men and women to posts and cover them in tar and set them alight, so to entertain, as he put it, the crowds at his garden parties. Christians were also torn apart by wild animals or by gladiators in the gladiatorial contests in places like the Colosseum there in Rome. Yet faced with that insane level of violence, the church responded, broadly speaking, consistently and faithfully with compassion, with love, living out their master's words to respond to violence with love. In fact, in AD 107, on his way himself to be martyred in Rome, an early leader of the church, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, wrote a letter that's been preserved 1900 years later, telling Christians who were being persecuted by the Romans, who were experiencing this kind of stuff, how they should respond. This is what he wrote on the way to his own death. He wrote, "In response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boasts, be humble, and in response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them. Let us show by our gracious forbearance that we are their brothers and sisters. Let us be eager to be the imitators of the Lord. And from the early church and from folks like Ignatius and others down through history, there have been lots of examples of Christians who have sought consistently and faithfully, often at great personal cost, to just live out that non-violent, compassionate and peaceful message of Jesus. You know, one of my heroes, one of my sort of standout heroes from history in terms of that kind of response to violence would be Martin Luther King Jr., key leader in the American civil rights movement, and of course a deeply, deeply committed Christian. And on the 28th of August, 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial there in Washington, he stood and he addressed the 250,000 people who had come to the American National Capital to demand equal rights for African Americans, and he gave one of the most famous speeches that's been given in the 20th century. You will recognize these words, I mentioned to many of you. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today." And what's interesting, if you read the whole text of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, King cites the Bible time and time and time again. For example, he says in his speech, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Anyone know where that comes from? Anybody? Well done. Yes, fantastic. You win a prize. One of David's books, free of charge for you. Oh, what a shame. Better still, he'll mail it to you. Amos 5:24. And of course, Martin Luther King's faith shaped his entire approach to justice, especially his commitment to non-violence and to not reciprocate with violence. On the 30th of January, 1956, Martin Luther King's house was firebombed while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Thankfully, the family were okay. But after the fire was put out and news spread, a large crowd of Martin Luther King's followers gathered outside his house, angry and demanding that and suggesting they march and they take up arms and they respond with violence. They take revenge. Martin Luther King stepped out of the still smoking remains of his house and addressed this crowd of people, looked at them and said, "My friends, go home." He urged them to love their enemies, not to take revenge, and he implored them to follow the example of Jesus and not to respond to hatred with hatred, but with love. And there are many other examples throughout history of people like him. One example that I often use when I do this talk in secular settings, just because it gets a fascinating reaction, is if you look at the example of missionaries. It's another really good example of where Christians have had a tremendous impact in history. Now, of course, there are lots of myths about missionaries, right? Particularly in today's world, and that we live in the sort of age of revisionist history, and many people will tell you, what terrible people missionaries were, and going around and converting people and causing terrible damage to traditional societies and so on and so forth. But like most myths, as we saw in David's talk, in terms of myths about science, myths about missionaries are also largely wrong. In 2010, an American sociologist called Robert Woodbury published the results of a massive academic study he had spent the last few years doing, looking at the impact of those missionaries who, in his language, preached for conversion. By which he means missionaries who didn't see themselves, their job as acting as agents of the state, missionaries who weren't simply there to advance the interests of British colonialism. Of course, Britain had a great empire, as it was once said. The sun never set on the British Empire, because not even God would trust us in the dark. And but he was looking at missionaries who threw that aside, who were genuinely preaching for conversion, and repentance, preaching the message and love of Jesus. His research, which has now been confirmed by over a dozen other studies, showed that the legacy of those missionaries has been dramatic. Let me read you one paragraph where he sums up what years and years of him studying and looking at the data has led him to conclude. He writes, areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are, on average, more economically developed today. with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental associations. He goes on and says, in places where conversionary Protestantism, to use his lovely academic phrase, where conversionary Protestantism was active in the past, he says you will typically find more printed books, more schools, whilst in Africa, the Middle East and parts of Asia, most of the leaders who led their countries successfully to independence had all been educated in Protestant missionary schools. To give you just one example, the lady on the screen behind me is Eliza Bridgman. In 1844, Eliza went to China as a missionary. 20 years later, she opened a school there in Beijing for girls who would otherwise have been forced into the sex trade or would more likely equally just have been left to starve. Well, her school eventually became part of Yenching University, one of China's first universities, now Peking University, arguably China's most prestigious university in the entire of that huge country, and it has Christian missionary roots. So all of that raises the question then of how do we judge? Because as we look back through history, we can see a mixed case. We can see terrible examples. We can see the Crusades. We can see the Spanish Inquisition. We can see the way the church capitulated in the face of Nazism, and so on and so forth. But then we can see tremendous impact and men and women behaving in a way that is extraordinary in their legacy. How do we judge that mixed historical record? Well, in the recent Australian documentary, For the Love of God, my friends at the Australian Centre for Public Christianity use a very helpful analogy. They say, consider a famous piece of classical music, perhaps Bach's cello suites. Now, you might go and hear one of the most famous and impressive cellists in the world. That's Yo-Yo Ma. He's a Chinese-American maestro. You could listen to him play that beautifully. Maybe he comes over here on a world tour. You go up to London, you hear him play that in the Royal Albert Hall. Incredible performance. Or I, who have not played the cello since I was 15. I studied the cello for 3 years, between the ages of 12 and 15, for 2 reasons. One, it got me out of playing rugby. And 2, the cello teacher was 23, a brunette and gorgeous. So I thought, I can get kicked to pieces on the field by you lot, or I can learn the cello with you. 3 years later, they replaced her with a large, hairy Russian gentleman, and my cello career was over, and hello, school chess team. But I could get my cello out of the cupboard, I could dust it off, maybe even tune it, and I could have a go at playing Bach's cello suites. How would you best judge the piece of music itself? By listening to a tone-deaf individual like myself with very little musical skill, or listening to somebody like this? How would you judge it? Presumably, you could only assess the quality of the piece of music itself, about how good Bach's composition was when you hear it played as its composer was actually intended. And what I want to say to my secular friends is I think it's exactly the same when we look at Jesus and when we look at the church. You can't truly assess the church one way or the other, actually, unless you look at the message of Jesus and you look at what has happened in history when women and men in different settings, often very difficult and trying settings, have faithfully tried to live the message of Jesus out, especially when they've done so at great personal cost. Yeah, there have been bad performances, but it is to the best performances, to the authentic performances, that our friends really need to look if they're going to be able to assess, okay, is the message of Jesus truly worth following? What does it look like in practice? Now, I found when I've done this in secular settings, even with people who are quite hostile, that's quite a helpful answer, and it certainly gets the conversation going. But there is still a problem. There is still a problem that I want to spend just a few minutes on as we wrap this up. You see, the problem is, if we're not careful, that answer I've just given, helpful as it may be, lends weight to the idea that Christianity is nothing more than a code of ethics. In other words, all we have to do is work harder to follow the teaching of Jesus, and the world will be a nicer place. You know, if people follow Jesus' commands to love one another, to do to others as you have them do to you, to respond not to violence with injustice and so on and so forth, the world would be a niceful place, it would be a kinder place, a peaceful place, far less insurance premiums, and estate agents would behave in a way that was much more moral. If we did that, the world would be a greater place. But here's the problem. The problem, of course, is we struggle to live up to codes of ethics. We fail to live up to our own standards, let alone Jesus's. And even if we have a code of ethics, or we're trying to follow Jesus's, and even if we live up to the code of ethics, then we have the problem that we then feel smug and self-righteous and self-satisfied because we can now look down from the tower of our self-righteousness on those swines over there who are not living up to our standards, and we have a problem. See, human beings have a terrible, terrible tendency to exclude others, to oppress others, to look down on others, and we have a nasty habit of co-opting religion and politics or actually even secularism into that mix. You see, I think it's always sobering, I say to my skeptical friends. I say, if I was a secularist, I would find the following statistics quite sobering. The Spanish Inquisition, that great secular whipping boy, look at how those terrible Christians behaved. Well, it killed 6,000 people in 350 years. More people are killed in the UK by bicycles each year than the Spanish Inquisition managed in 350 years. Still brutal, but relatively small in the grand scheme of things. By contrast, the French Revolution, that was avowedly secular, they managed to kill 18,000 people in 9 months. Stalin, atheistic Stalin, killed 20 million people in 30 years. To put that in context, Stalin achieved 2 Spanish Inquisitions every week for 30 years. Sobering. Now, my point is not that secular people are more violent than religious people. That's the last thing I'd want to suggest. That's not an attractive argument, and besides, having an argument with an atheist friend going, well, the church killed some people, but you killed more, and then sort of people in the middle going, yeah, but we all died. Not helpful. Rather, my point is the real issue is that human beings have this problem. We have this ability to be brutal, we have the ability to be mean and vicious and vindictive, and if we think that we are holier or nicer or smarter or more rational or more moral than others, we are especially dangerous as we tend to oppress those who don't measure up. So what's the solution? What's the solution? I love to ask that to secular audiences. What's the solution? Well, the solution is simply this. What we need is a basis for humility. We need a basis for something that humbles us, something that undercuts our tendency to think we are better than the person next to us, and thus undercuts our tendency to look down on others. And of course, that tendency to look down on others is one of the main problems with religion. Dave touched on this a little bit in his last talk. So many religions are built around the idea that it's about being a good person, a moral person, following the right system of ethics. So in Buddhism, you learn the right things and look down on those who are not as enlightened as you. In things like in Hinduism, it's all about having the kind of right mystical experience and going deeper into these truths than the person next to you. Islam, keep the commandments, and if you keep the commandments, you're a better person than the person next to you, so your chance of going to heaven is better than them. And even atheism doesn't escape, because atheists like to think they're rational, much smarter than the person next to them, especially those religious dumbasses. Every other religion is based upon looking down on other people. There is only one exception I know. Only one exception I know to that pattern, and that is the message of Jesus, the authentic message of Jesus. The message of Jesus, my friends, is not try and be a good person because that way you'll be more decent. The message of Jesus is certainly not, heaven forbid, hey, here is a really impressive set of standards that you're going to fail anyway. Try and measure up to them and God will like you more. Rather, Jesus' radical and incredibly humbling message is that human beings, you and I, each one of us here in this room, and all of our friends are so messed up and mixed up and screwed up and broken up that we don't have the ability to live good moral lives without inner transformation. And of course, the way you get that inner transformation is by accepting what Jesus did when he died for our brokenness, our mess-ups, our violence on the cross, taking the punishment we deserved for our self-righteousness, arrogance, and pride into himself and dealing with it. And thankfully, I'm so grateful Jesus doesn't stand there and just say, hey, live up to my incredible standards. Jesus rather offers to put right our own lives and then gives us the power through the Spirit to live differently and the power to respond to violence with forgiveness. If Jesus simply said, come on, you bunch of lightweights, when someone's wrong to you, just behave better and show compassion in return, we'd all fail. But Jesus offers the power to live differently, and that can make a massive difference. One last story to illustrate that. The lady on the screen behind me, some of you here may know of her story, not so well known today as I wish it were. She's a pretty incredible testimony. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. And in 1939, Corrie lived with her father and her sister in the Netherlands. While Holland fell to the Nazis in 1940 and soon attacks on Jews became commonplace. And Corrie and her sister Betsy and her father were committed Christians, so they began hiding Jewish families in their home and smuggling them out of the country to safety. And they rescued many, many people. But in 1944, disaster struck. They were found out by the authorities and they were arrested by the Germans, arrested by the Gestapo. Almost immediately after the arrest, her father died because of the maltreatment he'd received. But Corrie and her sister Betsy were shipped off to Ravensbrück concentration camp, a particularly vicious establishment that the Nazis had built just to deal with women prisoners. There, in that concentration camp, they suffered terrible violence and terrible abuse and terrible atrocities. Betsy died in captivity, but Corrie survived the war. And after the liberation, she was released, and she began a post-war career as an evangelist, traveling across Europe and preaching about the love of God. But then one day, something shocking happened. Let me read you a few paragraphs from her autobiography. Corrie writes, "It was at a church service in Munich that I saw him, the former SS officer who had stood guard at the shower room door and the processing centre at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers I had seen since that time. And suddenly it was all there, the room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, my sister Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. 'How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein,' he said. 'To think that as you preached, Jesus has washed my sins away.' His hand was thrust out to shake mine. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. So again, I breathed a silent prayer. 'Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness.' As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on Christ's, to which I can only say, I completely and utterly agree. Amen. Phil.